So I noticed when we were starting the beginning of this unit how comical it is of an idea to cover the amount of history from the fall of the Roman Empire up until the beginning of the Merovingian dynasty. It's simply a massive amount of material to be able to cover, and that took us 6 or 7 classes to be able to do. So it's equally comical to try to summarize it all in a single video. Nonetheless, that's what I'm going to try to attempt for you today. We left off talking about the Roman Empire was waning. The emperors were still over a somewhat thriving environment, but there were cracks in the system that were beginning to show. So much so that Diocletian decided to divide up the empire into 4 units. Diocletian is oftentimes noted for his cruelty to the Christians. As far as a military strategist, he wasn't dumb. He certainly knew what he was doing, and he recognized that the empire was getting to be too big. And so for practical purposes, he split up the empire. This is probably also why he was extremely worried about Christianity. He thought that the effects would be detrimental to the empire, and so he was particularly brutal in many of his tortures. We have many martyrs from his era as a result of his brutality. And as he decided to split up the empire into these 4 units, he divided it between Gaul, Italy, Illyricum, and just the eastern portion. We'll see it kind of ebbs and flows, goes back and forth, but the eastern portion largely remains, as that's going to become the Byzantine Empire when the Roman Empire will eventually fall in just a little while here. After Diocletian, shortly after, you have Emperor Constantine comes into power, and he does this first famously at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, where he's battling Maxentius, who is also a military leader, just north of the Tiber River, very close to Rome. In 312 AD, there's the battle with Maxentius at the Milvian Bridge, when Constantine sees in a vision or maybe a dream, in this sign, conquer. And on some accounts we see the Cairo, and on some accounts maybe we see the cross. But either way, he takes this as his battle cry for conquering Maxentius, and he decides to convert to Christianity shortly afterwards. He's not baptized until his deathbed. He famously waits until then to be baptized because of his understanding of the nature of baptism and his particularly challenging role as an an emperor. But nonetheless, he is Christianized largely at around 312 in that battle. And kind of as goodwill for the Christians, he officially promulgates the Edict of Milan in 313 AD. And that promulgation makes Christianity legal. Sometimes you'll hear people say that makes Christianity the religion of Rome. That's not true. That will eventually come to place, but it's not going to happen in 313 AD with with the Edict of Milan. Much later. As the head of the empire, Constantine is able to officially begin work on a new capital, well, at least become a new capital, which he rather humbly names after himself, Constantinople, and he engages in a rather large building project. This building project eventually, as I suggested, solidifies in Constantinople, and this becomes really the new center of the empire. And with this, there's an important thing that also happens. You have the 5th pillar of the pentarchy. Pente being 5, arche being rulers. And the pentarchy is the 5 most important bishops in the post-ancient Christian world, this kind of early medieval Christian world. Already we had talked about the 5 extremely important bishops, which we're going to refer to as the patriarchs of Rome, Antioch, Jerusalem, and Alexandria. Right? Most of you recognize that the patriarch of Rome is going to be officially known to most Westerners as the Pope. The Bishop of Constantinople, though, will also be an extremely important figure. And so now that Constantinople is built, and now that's made into the new head of the world, the capital gets kind of moved from Rome to Milan, back and forth, and we'll see it moves back and forth a bit more in the West. But Constantinople really takes over as the head of the Roman Empire during some of these last days, and it's going to stay the head in the east of the Byzantine Empire. And when we say the Byzantine Empire, what we really just mean is the Eastern Roman Empire. For lack of better terms, historians will call it the Byzantine Empire because Constantinople was built on Byzantium, the ancient city. But it really just is the continuation of the Roman Empire. Okay, so around this time, in the 300s, Arianism had been bubbling up for quite a while, actually. Arianism probably starts in Alexandria. It's famously attributed to Arius, who is a priest in Alexandria, and Athanasius is taking issue with Arian heresy. Whether or not Arius was Arian is a hotly debated historical question, but certainly there was a belief that we can refer to as Arianism, which was espoused, if not by Arius himself, then by various people around him. Arianism actually spreads down from Alexandria up into the German tribes by a series of Arian missionaries pretty quickly. And so it starts to infest many parts of the empire. And that not only causes religious tension, but it also causes political tension. Keep in mind, Constantine is wanting to, in some sense, keep the empire united as well. So this is a bit of a problem. And so in 325 AD, they convene, Constantine calls upon the bishops, especially the Pentarchy, to convene the Council of Nicaea. Those bishops that don't go directly send legates in their place, and they are able to formally define Nicene Christianity, which is going to recognize that the Son is eternally proceeding from the Father, of one substance with the Father, God from God, light from light, true God from true God. This is different from Arianism, not as it's sometimes referred to. Arianism will oftentimes get a worse rap than it needs to, in that people will suggest that Arians believed that the Son more or less came into being in 0 or approximately there, the first year AD, with the incarnation. And that's not actually what Arius says. Arius believed that the Son was just simply the first thing that God created, being that God is eternal and he begins to think, and that eternal word that proceeds from him is the Son. And that's not completely far off from the Trinitarian perspective. It's importantly heretical. It's importantly completely wrong as far as the metaphysics are concerned, but the language is remarkably similar. In Nicene Christianity, we want to recognize that the Son is eternally proceeding from the Father. So it's not simply the fact that he is proceeding, it's the fact that that procession is not taking place in a specific time. There was no moment when he was not, as Arians were wont to say. They would say there was a time when he was not, by which they wouldn't mean there was a time like 600 BC when he was not, but they would mean some time almost in eternity past. Nicene Christianity said, no. The Son is eternally begotten of the Father. And so I don't mean to say there's not a big difference between the two of them, but sometimes that difference is over-exaggerated. It's a critical difference for your theology, but we're probably not used to that level of nuance and specification, and so we tend to overly simplify it in order to make the exaggerated difference more clear. As I will argue, and as I've argued in this class, Arianism is, I think, the hinge that allows for something like Islam to spread later. So it has wide-reaching implications for religious and political divisions that will eventually come up. So keep an eye on that. Okay, so after the Council of Nicaea, after Nicene Christianity has been formally established, you still largely don't have a Nicene Christian empire, or surrounding like continental Europe and everywhere beyond that. Instead, there's still a lot of Arians around. There are famously all of the Goths, to the extent that they've converted to Christianity, are going to be Arian. The Vandals, which we'll see in a little while, are Arian. And then you have many non-Christians, such as the Huns, who, well, they're definitely not Nicene, at least. They're not Arian. The Huns are going to come down from the Baltic regions, and they're going to displace a group of Goths, which we know as the Visigoths. The Visigoths had settled kind of in the Black Sea area. And when the Huns come down, they come to the edge of the Roman Empire. The Visigoths asked the Romans if they can stay in the empire, not as citizens, but simply as a tribe that is currently living in the empire. They ask this of Emperor Valens, who grants them permission to stay there, but doesn't really offer them means of staying alive, doesn't offer them means of trade, doesn't offer them really any sort of provisions beyond just the protection of being within the borders of the empire. And so they grow quite frustrated at this deal eventually, and they actually end up rising up and killing Emperor Valens. And this happens at the Battle of Adrianople in 387 AD under King Alaric. From there, the Visigoths are going to go on down to Rome, and they're going to sack Rome in 410 AD, before eventually moving to Spain and Gaul and the Iberian Peninsula, where they will stay largely until the early 600s, mid-600s, when they will eventually be defeated by Islamic forces. Around that time, just north of that, you have in England, St. Patrick was born in 385 AD, and in 461 AD is when he died. He was born in England, but he was kidnapped from a pretty young age and brought over to Ireland. Now, during that time in England, the Anglos and the Saxons had actually moved up north from kind of where Denmark is right now. They moved across the sea. They settled into England. They sent a lot of the people who were already living in England during that time into like the area of Wales. And they were also selling people to the Irish as slaves. St. Patrick was one of them. And he was kidnapped, brought to Ireland as a slave, escaped, made his way back. And after making his way back, he was convinced that he needed to return to Ireland, but this time not as a slave, but as a missionary. So he became Bishop Patrick, and then brought Christianity to Ireland, even though it had been flourishing for a number of years, and even it had taken on a allegiance with the Roman Empire, thus becoming Nicene at that point already. It had thrived in what we now have as England and Wales today. Scotland's kind of another story. And it was beginning in Ireland. And so St. Patrick makes his way over there. During that time, he likely meets figures such as St. Bridget, and we can get into a whole bunch of fun Irish stuff. The important thing, though, is that though Christianity is going to largely thrive in Ireland because of the result of this, it is going to wane a bit in England, and it's going to be almost completely non-existent among the Anglos and the Saxons. So put a pin in that, because that's also going to come back in just a moment with some of the missionary work of figures like St. Augustine. That's St. Augustine of Canterbury, not St. Augustine of Hippo. But speaking of St. Augustine of Hippo, we're in the midst of reading his Confessions right now in the literature course. He's educated in Carthage. He's taught in Rome and Milan, and then he's converted under Bishop Ambrose of Milan. St. Augustine's an extremely important figure for Western Christianity, not only because of his life and the influence that he has, but especially because of his theological treatises. He writes a number of important books, one on the Trinity, De Trinitate, the other, The City of God, Confessions. The City of God is sort of his magnum opus, and that's where he writes his systematic theology. Primarily at this point, he's seeing that the empire is falling apart, and he's recognizing that though Rome has been absolutely pivotal to spreading the message of Christianity, that there's going to be some tension right now in what's taking place. And so he dichotomizes the city of man with the city of God. And there's interesting questions as far as whether or not he's referring to the city of God as some sort of spiritual, mystical, invisible reality, or whether he's referring to it as something like the ecclesiastical body that's existing on top of Rome at that moment, right? There's kind of interesting historical questions as far as what he means, but he uses this to develop his systematic theology, in which he's also going to, really importantly, argue for a view of the Trinity, in which the Father is eternally begetting the Son is eternally begotten of the Father, and here's the kicker, the love of the two, the love of the Father and the love of the Son, is the person of the Holy Spirit. And because of this, he is going to emphasize that the Spirit proceeds from both the Father and the Son. is the "and the Son" phrase, which is going to be extremely important about 1054 AD when there's a split between the East and the West of Christianity. And it's going to be over that phrase, or really that word in Latin, we'll translate it as filioque, and the Son. We can really see some of that being emphasized as early on as St. Augustine's works. So keep an eye on that as well, too. I'm not saying, by the way, that it wasn't present within Christianity before St. Augustine, but I mean, it kind of takes center stage with St. Augustine, just like with St. Athanasius, Christ's human nature takes center stage in a way that is, that Christ eternally being begotten takes center stage, right? His human nature does take central stage in other respects as well, too, but that's not exactly what I wanted to focus on right there. Okay, so at this point, the Vandals, they've been expelled from the Iberian Peninsula by the Visigoths. The Vandals, up until this point, had been living in Spain or Gaul, and once the Visigoths are moved over after having sacked Rome, they are led down south across the Strait of Gibraltar, and you're going to see this circle kind of loop around and around throughout much of history. They're led down south, they invade North Africa, and they finally find their way to Hippo, which at that point is where Augustine of Hippo had been bishop, right? He had converted a while before then, he had become bishop, and now he was becoming a rather influential bishop in Hippo. Hippo's an important place because two major controversies had arose during Augustine's tenure there. One is Pelagianism, eventually will kind of become semi-Pelagianism, and that will be addressed eventually in the Council of Orange, which happens in the 500s. Pelagianism more or less is saying that Christ redeems humanity such that you do not need grace in order to enter a state of grace. Well, that's a really confusing way of saying that, because you can tell that I think of this as a non-Pelagian. But let me think about this as Pelagius would say, you do not need grace in order to enter into something like a state of salvation. You might think of this as saying that Christ has erased the effects of sin nature so that now you can just continue and choose and live a life that is glorifying to him, apart from a further need of him reconciling you to him. This is a version of Pelagianism. It basically says that the work of Christ is such that you no longer need to be brought into further grace upon grace and then redeemed in that manner, which is what we confess readily, not only because of the controversies that are happening with St. Augustine, but because of figures like Paul and Jesus and really important people like that who also espouse this doctrine. Regardless of which, Pelagianism is happening. Simultaneous to that, you have what's called Donatism is happening. And Donatism is happening as a result of the fact that very many bishops, you don't even have to get to bishops, very many people during a lot of the more difficult times of persecution in Christianity had abandoned their faith. They had apostatized, and then they came back into the church. This brought up a really fascinating question. Well, what if the priest who baptized me was an apostate after he baptized me, right? What if he was in a state of apostasy, like he was doubting his faith while he was baptizing me? Is my baptism valid? If I go to church and receive communion and the person was invalidly baptized, is the communion licit? Am I supposed to be taking it? Do I need to be going to another parish? Do I need to be rebaptized? These are important questions during this point that people are asking, and the Donatists have a very hardline position, and they want to say that if there is any mixture of problem that's introduced into the lineage of priests or the lineage of bishops more specifically, if any of them had apostatized even after a matter, their ministry is considered null and void. Because they had a very hardline interpretation of the bride of Christ being a spotless bride or the body of Christ being a spotless body, both things that we would confess, and yet they wanted to say that this occurred at the level of individual sins for the person. And so if we found some strong indication of individual sins, such as apostasy, this would invalidate the ministry of the person baptizing or distributing the elements of communion or even things like confirmation and all that kind of stuff. And Augustine would, the Donatists would say, because of that, that entire ministry is null and void. Well, Augustine and many others had big problems with this, and they should, right? This is an absolute threat to the gospel because it seems to say something kind of similar to what is happening with the Pelagians. Although there are some important differences, but namely, for the Donatists, there is no room for redemption to take place. Okay, so there's a lot of controversy that's happening in Hippo. The Vandals come in, though, and what happens is the Donatists more or less abandon their position and cling to the Nicaeans. The Pelagians more or less simmer down their debates that are happening with the non-Pelagians. Those will pop up a little bit later, but Augustine kind of thoroughly squashes the Pelagians proper. It will evolve into something that we know of as semi-Pelagianism eventually. So once the Vandals have invaded Hippo, they pause for a moment and they decide that they are going to being led by King Gaiseric. They're going to move into Carthage. Beloved Carthage, as we've talked about a lot in this class already. So in 439, King Gaiseric leads them into Carthage, and now they're sitting primed just across the Mediterranean from Rome, setting their eyes on Rome. Okay, now we need to pause here for a second and think about what's happening in Rome during this time. This takes place during the pontificate of Leo the Great. Now, Leo the Great is important for a number of different things. First and foremost, I think the most important thing that he did is he disbanded Ephesus II. Ephesus II was a pseudo-council which took place in 449 AD. And I call it a pseudo-council, but for many it did not look like a pseudo-council. What was it exactly? Well, it was supported by the Emperor Theodosius II. It was held under the leadership of Discorsius I, who was the Patriarch of Alexandria. He was disposed at the time, and then the disposed, Patriarch of Constantinople named Flavian. And so it more or less has two major patriarchs and the emperor, which, if you recall, Constantine was the one that kind of convened Nicaea by getting all of the pentarchy together. And now we have the emperor and we have two major patriarchs, and so it seems like we're good to go, right? Well, Ephesus II was debating what we would now refer to as monophysitism. Now, sometimes monophysitism is equated with miaphysitism, both of which are going to refer to either the one will or the one nature of the God-man. Miaphysitism is something slightly different nowadays, so I'm not going to use that term. We'll refer to monophysitism. What this looked like basically is the monophysicists would say that the human nature of Christ, so far that it ever existed, is more or less swallowed up by his divinity. And so we can't even really refer to it anymore. Additionally, they might say things like Christ does not have two wills, a human one and a divine one, but simply only has the divine will. This, by the way, seems to go directly against the account that we have in the Garden of Eden, where Christ is praying, nevertheless, not my will, but your will be done. If there's only a divine will in the God-man, then it is nonsensical for him to be praying such things. That's just a subtle aside. But nonetheless, monophysitism is this idea that the natures, one nature being the divine nature, more or less swallows it up. And you have monophysicists saying these lovely poetic things like, the human nature of Christ is like a drop of honey in the sea, and it's completely swallowed up by the monstrous sea, or the expansive sea. They probably wouldn't say monstrous. And so too, the divine nature just completely swallows up Christ's human nature, so it's really not appropriate to call him the God-man or anything like that. Well, this becomes a big problem for theological reasons, and once Pope Leo hears of this, Leo the Great, he hears of this, he says, oh my goodness, this cannot stand. He writes a scathing letter to the people who convened Ephesus, to the emperor, and especially to the patriarchs, and we refer to this now as Leo's Tome. And Leo's Tome is read at the beginning of the council that Leo convenes, which is called the Council of Chalcedon. That happens in 451 AD. The Council of Chalcedon is extremely important because this is what we typically refer to as what we do refer to as the orthodox positions on Christ's nature. And this is especially where it's defined that Christ has a hypostatic nature, fully God and fully man, united in the person of the Son. Two natures, one divine person. Okay, so Leo the Great more or less disbanded Ephesus too with a single swipe, convened Chalcedon, and wrote his tome to absolutely just tear into Ephesus too as well too. Certainly shaking up some things, but that's not the only thing he did. The Huns, having pushed the Visigoths out from the Black Sea, had now finally decided that it was their turn to come to Rome, and so they begin to position themselves outside of the city of Rome. Keep in mind that the city had already been sacked in 410. Well, Leo gets word of this, and he sends to meet with Attila in 452. Attila, the leader of the Huns. And they're able, over a conversation, of which we don't know exactly what happened, Leo the Great is able to convince Attila not to invade. Now, whether Attila planned on invading later or not, we don't exactly know. Attila is going to move back up into the Balkans. He's going to engage in a political marriage, which is going to go really badly for him in that he's going to die on the night of his wedding through somewhat suspicious circumstances. That being said, we don't know if he was murdered or if he just happened to die on that hopefully it was a jubilant day for him. Regardless of which, he moved on to his reward. After Attila leaves, Leo decides to meet with Gaiseric. Remember, Gaiseric was down in Carthage, the king of the Vandals at this point. And Gaiseric was wanting to invade as well. Well, Leo is not able to convince him not to bring any army to invade Rome, but he's able to convince him not to burn the city, which would have been absolutely disastrous for the city. It's not like today, when you think of a burning happening and being relatively confined. It would have largely destroyed huge parts of the city. And he convinces him also to save all of the basilicas. And this happens just 3 years after he's met with Attila. So Leo does a number of things to actually keep some sort of union with the Roman Empire, within like the city of Rome, from actually just completely falling apart. Nonetheless, he doesn't actually succeed in stopping a final attack on Rome happening. And so in 476, under the Emperor Romulus Augustus, which is a extraordinarily ironic name to take, Romulus being the first king of Rome, Augustus being arguably the greatest emperor of Rome. Romulus Augustus is the emperor when Rome is finally defeated by the Vandals. Now at this point, the Vandals are no longer being led by, why am I blanking all of a sudden? Gaiseric, there we are. No longer being led by Gaiseric, but instead they become led by a man named Odoacer, sometimes referred to as Odoacer. I'm not sure which one is more correct. Now, Odoacer was probably related to Attila, or at least some of the Huns, through a kind of very complex history. I believe that his father is thought to have been a Hun. Nonetheless, he was a Vandal. He ended up finding his way over there. He had become king of the Vandals, and he goes in and he sacks Rome in 476. And at that point, Romulus Augustus is largely considered the last Roman empire of the unified empire. Now, Rome has a king, King Odoacer. He doesn't last for too incredibly long because eventually King Theodoric of the Ostrogoths, remember, the Ostrogoths had split from the Visigoths. First, they were just the Goths. And then they kind of settled in two geographic regions that are neighbors with one another near the Black Sea. The Ostrogoths were a little bit further south than the Visigoths. The Visigoths are sent over to the Iberian Peninsula because of the coming in Huns, and they send the Vandals down. Well, the Ostrogoths had stayed there. And after having watched the Vandals take over Rome and Odoacer becoming the king, the Ostrogoths decided about 20 years later in 493 to put their ruler in charge. And so under the ruler of the king, of their king, Theodoric, they decide that they are going to invade Rome, take over, and underneath the pontificate of Simplicianus, they now have power. Well, this is kind of a big deal. Why is it a big deal that suddenly Rome is being led by the Ostrogoths? Because the Ostrogoths are Arian. Now, the Vandals were Arian, to be clear as well, too. But the Vandals were relatively non-pushy Arians, for lack of better terms. The Ostrogoths, on the other hand, they wanted everyone to be Arian. Now, Theodoric was willing to have some concessions. So Theodoric moves the capital of now of what was like the western half of the Roman Empire. He moves the capital of his new kingdom to Milan, which is up north and a little bit west of Rome. And he gets a number of important political leaders who are Nicaean. Those political leaders, especially the important ones for our purposes, are Boethius and Cassiodorus. Boethius we're going to talk about a lot later in this course. He has very important theological positions to hold, and he's going to rather famously, probably the most significant thing that he does is he comes up with what is largely agreed, at least until the 18 or 1900s, agreed upon definition of a person as an individual substance of a rational nature. You might say, well, that seems like a very unimportant thing to define, or at least not important in the grand scope of things. It's extremely important in Christianity because we've just had several councils on what we mean by the divine substance and the persons of the divine substance. We've also talked about Christ's human nature and the fact that he is hypostatically united in one person. And so the definition of a person is going to be extremely important. That comes from Boethius, and famously we have his, he does lots of translations also of Aristotle. He brings in important philosophical categories into Christianity, and his emphasis can almost not be underestimated. He writes Constellation of Philosophy, which we'll read together as well, too. Cassiodorus is also a Nicaean political leader up in Milan, but he's a political leader of a different type. Most notably, he establishes what we now know of today as the liberal arts tradition. Something like this had already been going, but Cassiodorus is most influential for setting up the sectors of the trivium and the quadrivium, where trivium is grammar, rhetoric, and logic, or grammar, logic, and rhetoric, and the quadrivium is arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. Those are the core pillars of the liberal arts tradition, and they are more or less set into place by Cassiodorus while he's up there with Boethius and Theodoric in Milan during the reign of the Ostrogothic rule in this kind of portion of what was the Western Roman Empire. If you're paying attention to that whole sentence and you got all the little pieces everywhere, good on you. You're doing great. Okay, so around this time, a little bit later, fast forwarding by just a few years, a new emperor takes reign of the Eastern Empire. And again, we refer to the Eastern Roman Empire now. It really is just the Byzantium Empire. Now, the Byzantine Empire is headed by Emperor Justinian. Justinian lives from 527 AD to 565 AD. And after Theodoric dies in 526, Emperor Justinian sees his opportunity after he rises in power, sees his opportunity, says, Theodoric was a great ruler of the kind of small region that he had territory over. It wasn't terribly small, but comparatively to like the Roman Empire, it certainly was, of this region that he had territory over. And the Visigoths aren't overwhelmingly impressive, and the Vandals haven't really moved that much around from their southern areas of North Africa and the areas that they've had of Rome. And so I think I can actually take my moment and reconquer these lands and reunify the Roman Empire. And he's surprisingly successful. He actually destroys the Vandals. He defeats the Ostrogoths. He establishes a universal law, Corpus Juris Vivilis, which is this corpus, like this body of laws for all people. It's the foundation of modern civil law, and he introduces the concepts of property law and contract law. He introduces the idea of a burden of proof. He introduces the idea of international law. All of this we still have today. He does not introduce the distinction of the relationship between the law and the ruler, which that will eventually come in the 1200s or so in England. That's not quite here yet, though. But he does all of this. He builds the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, which is It's now Istanbul. What was then Constantinople. Before that, Byzantium. He builds the Hagia Sophia. He builds the Hippodrome there. The Hagia Sophia is going to be one of the most important churches ever built. He does that in 537 AD. And then he attempts to reunify everything. He's really close. Unfortunately, two big things come in his way. One, it's thought to be that there was a volcanic eruption in Iceland during the 540s, 550s. I can't quite remember. Regardless of which, it has tremendously bad effects for not only the weather, but also global health. And the weather conditions make famines tend to pop up quite a bit. So even though this is a very far north volcanic eruption, it seems to be a pretty big one, if we can tell right. And it affected the global weather conditions, at least around Europe, very negatively. And so there was not a lot of opportunities to get food. And this drop in one's immune system was not great timing, because a plague also swiped through the land as well too, which we sometimes know as Justinian's plague. I think it's really unfair that he gets the rap for that, right? He was actually doing his best to actually reunify everything and to bring about flourishing and prosperity, and lo and behold, he gets a plague named after him. But, you know, such is how it goes. So Justinian is not quite successful, and after his reign, things more or less fall apart to a version of how they were before. The Visigoths are more or less still over there on the Iberian Peninsula. France is continuing to be, or Gaul, the rest of Gaul is continuing to be Arian, kind of. Anywhere that's like east or northeast of that is definitely Arian. And then during this time, we have another important figure, another great figure, Pope Gregory the Great, Gregory the First. And he is a Benedictine. That's a bit of an anachronistic name. He's not a Benedictine himself, but he follows the rule of Saint Benedict. He was a monk. He gets along with Benedict really well during his life. I believe that they had a relationship, if I'm not mixing up something, that I'm thinking of something else. And he decides to kind of spread this idea of ora et labora, right, of work and prayer, which is kind of like the Benedictine way of life. And importantly, he also sets a number of missionaries out to England. And this is where we get the second St. Augustine that I mentioned earlier. This is St. Augustine of Canterbury. Remember that England had largely continued to remain still either pagan or kind of other quasi-religious things. St. Augustine goes into Canterbury. Well, he doesn't go to Canterbury. He marches basically into Kent, which is where the Angles and the Saxons had set up rule. And he meets with King Ethelbert and is able to convince King Ethelbert to convert to Christianity. And this has a very similar effect to Constantine, except for probably even tenfold for the area of what we know of now as England and even Wales. It just causes mass conversions. There's also at this time resources that are being sent over to Ireland so that the flourishing Irish community that is already there can really develop monasteries and be sent important books and documents that otherwise probably would have been destroyed in continental Europe around this time. So there's just extremely important things that happen up north in what we now know of as the UK and Ireland today. St. Columba is a missionary that goes back and forth between England and continental Europe as well during this point, who lives in the mid-500s. Okay, so also with St. Columba going back and forth between England and Gaul, we have a Frankish king. We're going to refer to him as a Frankish king because now the area, what we know of as France, is going to be more or less starting to solidify, not into the nation of France, but into something that's kind of close to it, at least geographically speaking. This area is going to be ruled by a number of different kings until you have King Clovis. King Clovis was born in 482 AD, and he died in 511 AD. Now, he is a member of the Merovingian dynasty. The Merovingian dynasty had been already kind of up and running, for lack of better terms, but it wasn't super pronounced until Clovis. A couple things happen that are important. First off, in the year 500 AD, Clovis converts to not just Christianity, but to Nicene Christianity at the beck and call of his wife. His wife was a Nicene Christian. I believe she might have been ministered to, if not by St. Columba, by some of the people that were connected with him. She was a Nicene Christian, and so Clovis eventually converts to Nicene Christianity. And that puts him, really at a strategically amazing place politically, because if you think about England and Ireland kind of to the northeast and Rome to the southwest, northwest and southeast are both going to be the Nicene Christians that he's going to want to have some strategic alliance with. So maybe you could critique him and say he's doing military strategic things. I tend to take a more optimistic view, and I think he had a genuine conversion, similar as I do with Constantine also. Nonetheless, he converts in 500 AD. As a member of the Merovingian dynasty, he then also engages a number of military campaigns and really unifies the entirety of Gaul. So not so much of what we think of as Spain, that is more or less still possessed by the Visigoths, but he possesses what we will soon come to know of as Neustria, Austrasia, and Burgundy. And those three regions are going to be divided up for his sons after he dies in 511. That's going to be extremely important because from Clovis, we're going to get Charlemagne. And Charlemagne is just Charles the Great, Charles Magnus, right? And Charlemagne will be the first, largely as we usually will conceive of it, the first Holy Roman Emperor. So that's all coming from the lineage of Clovis. But it's important to recognize now we have a more or less a straight line running somewhat at an angle throughout Europe, including the islands, and going all the way down to Italy, and then going much further east and continuing all the way over to Syria, which has allegiance to Nicene Christianity, and Nicene Christianity in communion with the Pentarchy at this point. And all five of those bishops are still in communion with one another, at least for another 554 years. All right, that's taking place. Meanwhile, on the other end of the world, and at least the known world, or like the world that we would think about this time for our purposes, not as far east as things like China or Japan, but in Arabia, things have been percolating for a little while. Arabia was largely influenced by a Bedouin community. The Bedouins were nomads, for lack of better terms. They would go back and forth between various different places where there was water and food. The majority of Arabians probably weren't Bedouins, but the Bedouins had a very important role in keeping a sense of unity between the people of Arabia. They would, after all, be kind of the go-betweens. Arabia was, of course, largely influenced by emperors like the Persian Empire. You have that to the east, and then to the west you have things like Egypt, right? So they're kind of sandwiched between those two things with a lot of land that is extremely difficult to traverse. And so after camels are, I'm blanking on the word for it. It's the thing when you make the dog, such as you can actually have the dog in your house. You can figure out whatever word it was. But camels are made, they're trained, right? So that you can actually ride on them. The Bedouin society begins to thrive. And it's especially important for different trade routes, and notably the trade route from India to Constantinople for things like spices and especially incense. Incense is extremely, extremely important for Christian worship, especially during this time. And so this Bedouin society is helping with these. It's been influenced by some of the religions of Persia, especially Zoroastrianism, which is a type of monotheism. It's been influenced by types of Judaism, right? The Judaism that we could think of when Jews fled under Alexander the Great and fled to, under the Maccabean revolt and fled to Alexandria. Some of them also went down to Arabia. There also seemed to be some like proto-Jewish religions who kind of had like this faith in Abraham and Abraham's God, but didn't really have like a fully espoused Judaism as well too. And then there was a type of Arabian paganism where they had many different gods of different tribes and stuff like that they would more or less all take together. There was also in Mecca, which is like kind of southwest Arabia, there was this important black stone. The black stone was believed to be from the time of Adam, and there was also what we know of as the Kaaba. This was a center of worship in Mecca for all of these various different gods. There were probably some Christians practicing as well too, and notably, Arianism was percolating at this point. Arianism was kind of an interest. Okay, in all of that, in 570 AD, Muhammad is born. Muhammad then claims to experience a series of visions, and these visions are from the angel Gabriel, and they are about the nature of revelation, and he's told to memorize things. The things that he memorized ultimately become the Quran. Muhammad himself, at very least, claims to be illiterate, and he has others write down these poetic visions, for lack of better terms. Writes down these things that he's been memorizing, and forms a religion, which we now know of today as Islam, which is just going to mean submit to Allah, where Allah just is the name for God. Now, Islam is a very difficult religion to pin down because it fractals a lot. And it fractals a lot in pretty important ways. This, in some ways, is not too distinct from various different fractalizations of Christianity that we've experienced. But I would say in Islam, there can be some more fundamental fractals. One of the biggest one is, what exactly is the Quran? Is it the literal words that are being written? Or is it some sort of inherent meaning underneath those words? And the reason they're asking these questions is because the questions of Arianism had already been percolating. Arianism is the idea that the eternal word of God proceeds as a first act of creation of God. The first act that God does. So too, Islam is going to see the Quran, or at least maybe the thing behind the Quran, the truth behind or something, as the first thing or the very thing that's spoken of by God. And meanwhile, anyone else that is a prophet of this is proceeding forth from God in a created way. And so the word of God for Islam, they kind of take a semi-Nicene approach where they say this word is eternal, but it's not the person of the Son, it is the word of the Quran. And so you can see what they're working with these Christian concepts, but they're inverting them in ways that are, well, and they're very detrimental to the actual theology of Islam. But they're certainly not completely distinct from the questions that Christians are asking in all ways at this point as well, too. Now, there's a lot of different flow in and out of these Bedouin societies. And so Muhammad is able to pick up a lot of information from various different travelers that are coming from Constantinople, going over to India, bits of Persia. Muhammad is eventually, because he spreads this religion, he's kicked out of Mecca, which is the center of religion largely in Arabia. And he moves up north to what we now know of as Medina, which was then Yathrib. And this is called the Hijra. The Hijra is like the original Hajj, which Muhammad does after being kicked out of Mecca. And this is year 1 in Islamic calendars. It's such an important year because this is when, more or less, Islam is thought to really begin. And it begins then for 10 years of military conquest. Those 10 years will go until Muhammad dies in 632. So he goes up to Yathrib, which is now Medina, in 622, begins a series of military conquests, uniting disparate forces in Arabia together for 10 years until he dies. Now, this is where it gets especially complicated because right before he dies, Muhammad takes his son-in-law, Ali, who is married to his daughter, Fatima, and he holds his hand up, Ali's hand, and says, if something along the lines of, I'm blanking on the exact quote, but something along the lines like, if you are a friend of Muhammad, you are a friend of Ali. And the tricky word is, I said friend there, but you could translate it in a number of different ways. One of them is something similar to, if you follow Muhammad, you follow Ali, or if you follow Ali, you follow Muhammad. And then shortly after that, he's actually going to die. Now, he dies from likely poisoning that he received years earlier. It's not necessarily under suspicious pretext. Like, they know who poisoned him and everything. It just was it caused, I think, like liver failure or something, which he lived with for a number of years. But he eventually did die. When he died, Ali was not nearby. And one of his other most important military leaders, known as Abu Bakr, was also not nearby. But there were a series of important Islamic leaders that were witnessing Muhammad's death. Muhammad then rather famously asked for a pen and paper, or the equivalent thereof at very least, and was going to write something down, presumably, even though, again, he was presumably illiterate. And these military leaders said nope. And so Muhammad died without ever having appointed his successor. The leaders decided upon Abu Bakr. When Ali found out about this, he was pretty enraged. Nonetheless, he decided to, as his religion suggested, to submit. And so he did, and Abu Bakr lived as the first caliph. Caliph is just going to be the type of leader that he was within Islam. He was not considered to be the prophet. That was Muhammad's role. But he was a certain important leader, political leader of sorts, which was going to kind of keep Islam unified. Well, Abu Bakr dies, and eventually Ali does become appointed as the caliph. And so it seems like this is more or less going to work out. The two different diverse camps are going to come together of who we thought the leader should be. And during this time as well, I should say, there's a lot of important battles. So Muhammad dies in 632. You have what's known as the Battle of Yarmouk in 636. And then in 636 as well, Muslims return to Mecca. Islamic forces overtake Syria in 640, just 4 years later. And then 5 years later, they overtake the Persian Empire. So you can see Yarmouk, by the way, is just kind of near, it's the eastern side of where Galilee is in Syria. So like right around where Jesus was born, right? So now, and then once they've overtaken Syria and they have the Persian Empire and they have Mecca now, they really have all of that territory that they have control of. Well, Ali, having ruled as the caliph, is murdered by another leader known as Muawiyah. Now, Muawiyah murders him in 661. And I believe his family, if I'm not mistaken as well, Ali's family. And decides to become, he doesn't decide to be, he's positioned as the next caliph. And he sets up what's called the Umayyad Dynasty. The Umayyad Dynasty basically means that now his successive generations will be the next caliphs. The difficulty is that a lot of people already had come to the conclusion that Ali was the right successor of Muhammad. And not only that, they understood that the successor of Muhammad was not just a caliph, was not just some sort of political governor, but was actually more or less a mystical figure that understood the inner meaning of the Quran. That the Quran was not just related to the identical words that were on the page in Arabic, however important those words were for Islam, but that it was actually the inner meaning of those words, which were only understood by what they referred to as the Imam. And so they said that Ali was the first Imam, and that the next Imam becomes the next successor in the lineage, which is his firstborn son. And then that firstborn son more or less takes the position of Imam after Ali dies, and that continues for generations. And so once Muawiyah sets up the Umayyad dynasty, this basically puts Ali's dynasty of Imams in contrast to the Umayyad dynasty of caliphs. And so now you have this more or less governorship in Islam that's set apart from the spiritual successors of Muhammad in what becomes known as Shia Islam. And Shia follows Ali, and Sunnis follow the whole series of caliphs, and there's a lot of battles actually that take place between these different forces. Now, this continues to fractal because you're going to have complications like one of Ali's great, like 7 generations down, his grandsons will end up dying after his firstborn son. And so there's a bunch of questions as far as who takes the successor after that and stuff along those lines. Not exactly important for our purposes right now, but it's interesting to see what that ends up becoming. Regardless of which, Islamic forces finally decide in 710 that they're going to cross the Strait of Gibraltar and they're going to destroy the Visigothic army within 5 years. So, within 15 years. By 725 AD, they've destroyed the Visigothic army. They're then going to loop back around and try to attack the city of Constantinople, which they're going to fail at. But now you see that the tides have turned really quickly for Christianity in the Western world. Before, the entirety of the Roman Empire was Christian. Outside forces were more or less Arian. But nonetheless, you had Europe and North Africa and Syria and even parts of Persia were largely Christian at this point, and maybe even parts of India, depending on which sources you're reading. Now, suddenly, Persia is Islamic. Arabia is Islamic. Egypt, Alexandria, North Africa, what we know of as Morocco today, Islamic. All of Spain, Islamic. This is devastating to not only the Christian missionary work, but also to the political, the Christian political forces, right? Remember that we have pretty important patriarchies in those regions. The regions of Alexandria, the regions of Jerusalem, and Antioch are 3 of the 5 patriarchs. The other 2 being Constantinople and Rome, which are weakened at this point. And so there's a lot of tension as far as what's going to happen next and if Christianity is going to survive. Spoiler, it does. But the way that it does is probably not exactly how you're thinking it is. So we'll get to that in the next unit.